Everybody to the 40th Fireside Great Minds Talk organised by the University of Buckingham. Welcome in particular if you are new to the series, and tonight we have a huge treat of one of the most distinguished and exciting thinkers amongst those who have been very successful frontline politicians and secretaries of state, who also has a steady torrent of books, really good, thoughtful books flowing out of his innovative mind. So I'm not going to, everyone knows who you are. Can I just say, do you have the questions ready as usual? Can I also say, do circulate the details of this talk so people can see it on Catch Up and on all the others to your friends. We have several thousands who are now listening to these talks. I'm going to hand over to Lord Baker now, who's going to give us an illustrated talk on assassinations. So hold your seats very tight, and we're going to be in for a white knuckle ride. Kenneth Baker. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me, Joe, to this to your range of talks. And tonight I'm going to talk about my latest book on assassinations. And you might well ask me, why have I written a book on assassinations? Well, I've known 8 people, politicians, who've been assassinated, 6 British and 2 Sri Lankans. And 2 of them were very close friends. And this is the first slide. And Matthew is controlling the slides. So Matthew, will you start, please, controlling the slides? Right.
They will come up in just a second.
Your black bar is on the bottom, Matthew. Take it off in some way. Can you start, Matthew? Now, this is the first one. There were 2 close personal friends who were assassinated. This is Ian Gow, who was the parliamentary private secretary to Margaret Thatcher from 79 to 81, at a time when Margaret was very unpopular with the Conservative Party because it was a very, very difficult time. Inflation was roaring away, interest rates were very high, unemployment was high. And Ian did an enormous amount to consolidate the Conservative Party to support Margaret in those days. He was a very strong Ulster Unionist and came out very strongly in favour and very much against the IRA. And they killed him by putting a bomb under his car at his house in Eastbourne. Blew up and he was killed. And it was a great sadness to me because we were very close. We were neighbours in Eastbourne. I spent many times playing cricket and croquet with him and his children. And he was a great loss to the party. The second was Tony Berry, who was the Deputy Chief Whip. And he was killed in the Brighton bombing. And on the night that the bomb went off, Mary and I had to leave Brighton because I was having a debate with Ken. I was the Minister for Local Government, and I was having a debate with Ken Livingstone early in London that morning on the abolition of the GLC. And as we came down the steps of the hotel, who would be going up but Tony Berry? He'd been exercising his dog as we chatted. It was a successful conference, rounded off by a good speech by Margaret that morning. 3 hours later, he was dead. And when I reflected on the death of these 2 and the other 4 British and the other 6 people I knew, were their lives in vain, in fact? And unfortunately they were tremendous tragedies for their families, great sadness, but they did not really affect politics very much. And the assassins did not achieve their objective. The IRA wanted to create a united Ireland, and they were not going to do it by assassinating people like this. In fact, they were going to, consolidate the feeling against the IRA. As Margaret said, terrorists must always be defeated. This made me think about the speech in Macbeth, when Macbeth went back to his castle and found that the King of Scotland, Duncan, was his guest that night. And he contemplates assassination. And in this speech, in the second line, that's the first time the word assassination has ever appeared in any written work. And in this very short speech, he analyzes if assassinations work and comes to the conclusion, in fact, they don't, because being a violent act, they will breed violence. And you can see in the last 4 lines that I've highlighted, but in these cases, we still have judgment here. That we but teach bloody instructions, which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poison chalice to our lips. And that was the first time, in fact, that poison chalice was actually used. So let's start with a very famous assassination, that of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. He was assassinated by Brutus and Cassius and a group of other senators and friends to prevent him becoming a king. The Senate was about to offer him the kingship. He had a golden throne in the Senate, and they wanted to uphold the principles of the Roman Republic and prevent a dictator taking over. The assassination was followed by a civil war for 2 years, and Mark Antony defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, where they'd gone to Greece to form an army, and they then fell upon their swords. So for them, personally, it was a poison chalice. But the civil war went on, and Mark Antony fought Octavian Caesar, who was Caesar's nephew, and he was defeated by Octavian Caesar at the Battle of Actium, a sea battle, 15 years later. And then Octavian Caesar made himself the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, and gave himself powers infinitely greater than the powers that were going to be given to Caesar in 44 BC. And so it was really, again, poison justice, actually, poison chalice, very much so, because it did not achieve at all. In fact, it created the very reverse. Let me start first with the well-known assassination in English history of Spencer Perceval. Here he is, he's being shot by Bellingham. Bellingham, there's no politics in this at all. Bellingham was an aggrieved businessman who'd been in prison in Russia and over a trade business, and the government didn't help him, so he came in and decided to shoot the Prime Minister, grudge. Justice was very quick in those days. He was executed within a week, and if you want to see his skull, it's in the St. Bart's Hospital Museum, and there was no political consequence. The Foreign Secretary, Liverpool, was made Prime Minister immediately and was a successful Prime Minister for 15 years. So it was really a sort of an unimportant event. At the moment, this is an individual assassin. So I'm going to deal with a few individual assassins because they're rather rare these days. Now, the next one is a famous one, Charlotte Corday. She lived in Normandy, and she was appalled that the Jacobins had executed all the Girondins, including Danton, the great and famous other leader of France. And she was determined to try and stop this reign, the beginning of the Reign of Terror. So she went to Paris, went to a butcher's and bought a butcher's knife for 2 francs, and went to knock to the door of Marat. Marat was the editor of one of the Jacobin papers, and he even wrote out the list of people to be guillotined each day. And Marat's staff said, no, don't come in. But Marat heard her, she said, come in, come in. She went in, she said, I'm coming from Normandy. I want to tell you about the Girondins there. Marat said, good, I'll add them to my list. Whereupon she stamped him. But she was again not successful because a month later, Robespierre launched the Real Terror, in which 17,000 people were guillotined. So I'm afraid even for her, this very brave single woman, it was in fact a poison chalice. I want to just with 2 other individual assassins because individual assassins are rather rare today. And this is Kennedy, a minute before, and the next one is a minute after. And no one really knows what the motivation of Lee Harvey Oswald was. More has been written about this assassination than any other, and there are many, many interpretations. But the real question was, did it change the history of the world? Well, within hours, LBJ, as you know, was sworn in as president. Immediately, there was no discontinuity, there was no political crisis of the moment. That's how the Constitution works. He was quite a successful president, very more successful probably than Kennedy in social affairs. But the issue is, if Kennedy had lived, would he have got America out of Vietnam more quickly than LBJ? It's a very interesting question. I take the view that he wouldn't have done. The speech he was going to make in Dallas later that day committed strong support to South Vietnam because the battle between North and South Vietnam had become the hot war in the Cold War. And America and the West were determined not to let the communists take over South Vietnam. Because the theory in those days, if they did, it was the domino theory, all the other countries in Southeast Asia would fall, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, and even Indonesia. And in fact, Kennedy had put in 50,000 Americans into Vietnam. And as the election was coming up in 1964, he would not have fought the election on the basis of coming out of Vietnam. That is, other people have other views, but Max Hastings, in his remarkably great history of the Vietnam War about 2 years ago, does support that interpretation. One other individual assassin who was very important was the assassin of Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray. He was a habitual criminal and a madman, actually. And he was going to try and stop the civil rights movement. So when he discovered that Martin Luther King was going to Memphis, and he found in the hotel he was staying in, he then booked a room in the other hotel, the room across the other side on the left-hand side where the curtains are slightly drawn. And by standing in the bath, he could get his rifle aimed on the actual balcony. And he just patiently waited until Martin Luther King came out to have a cigarette, and he shot him. And they identified him. He was immediately arrested, and was put into asylum eventually. But this did not stop the civil rights movement. In fact, it probably made it infinitely stronger because it created a martyr, and it was actually irreversible. One other individual assassin, and that is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was a very unlucky chance that he was shot that night, because for the first act of the theatre, there was one guard outside the door of the box. But he got a bit bored, he went to the local tavern, and there was no guard at all. And so this out-of-work actor, John William Booth, went in and shot him. He then jumped over the box into the theatre and got away that night. But within a week, he was caught and shot when he was escaping from a barn. And he said, "Tell mother I died for my country." What were the political consequences of this assassination? They were not great. The great achievements of Abraham Lincoln in abolishing slavery, in winning the war, and holding the United States together were permanent and significant victories that could not be reversed by any of his successors. And indeed, none of his successors wanted to do it. And so this solitary, as it were, brave attempt to kill him by a passionate Southerner has had no effect at all upon the history of America. It did rob America of one of its greatest presidents. There's no question about that. But his great work had been completed. Now, let me just deal with now two political murders in the UK. The first one is Erin Eve. I was actually in the House of Commons the day. It was after lunch when I heard an explosion, went down to see if the chamber it hadn't. And then we discovered it was somewhere outside. So I went into one of those windows and looked down and saw this car. And it was very quickly identified as Erin Eve. I saw the master of ceremonies going down in his sort of court uniform to identify poor Erin. The bomb had been placed under his car. He had a flat in Westminster just round the corner. And it was a clever bomb. It only went off when the car went up a slope. And then you would have to go up a slope because Erin would park in the underground car park. And he was killed. This was just before the 1979 election. And Erin Eve was clearly going to be the Ulster Secretary. And he was a passionate supporter of the Ulster Unionists and would have given absolutely nothing at all to the IRA or to the people who wanted any sort of separation. And so they destroyed one of the most enthusiastic supporters of Ulster Unionism by that day. But it did not further the cause of the IRA who wanted to unite Ireland. You're not going to unite Ireland by killing British politicians in this way. And Margaret said it was the death of one of freedom's warriors. And she also said, we will never let terrorists prevail. The second individual murder was Lord Louis Mountbatten. Again, just before the election in 1979, he had a house just south of the border, and he would always go there for a family holiday on the local lake. And this was one of the happier days. And on the day that happened, he and two other people were killed by a bomb left by the IRA. Again, the IRA did not promote its cause by these sorts of murders and terrorist activities. They have not created a united Ireland, and it would be very difficult to actually for that to come about without an enormous change of heart in the north. One thing that has happened in the last few years is an increase in religious killings as well as political killings. And the example I give you now is the most serious one. This happened just last year on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. And this is the suicide bomber walking across to the church. So a suicide bomber has become an agent of assassination, not only of one person, but of many people. And when he detonated his bomb in his church, 259 Christians were killed. But the suicide bomber is still used as agents of assassination against particular events or against particular people. But one of the things I discovered in this analysis of assassinations was that individual assassins are now much rarer. And since 1945, we have moved into the era of state-targeted killings, where individual governments become the supporters of assassination and actually plan assassinations with their security forces and with their agents. And two countries that have indulged in this to a very great extent are Israel and Russia. First, let me deal with Israel. This quotation comes from the Talmud. If someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. And a book was written about 2 years ago called Kill Him First by the most distinguished journalist in Israel and probably the best modern historian, Ronan Bergman. And he had very carefully, over a period of 10 years, constructed the history of Mossad from 1948, the day in which Israel became an independent country. And since that time, they have been beleaguered, attacked. They're surrounded by enemies. There are certain countries that want Israel to be obliterated and support terrorists affecting Israel. And so Mossad and the other security forces in Israel, he reports, has conducted 1,500 operations against specific groups and plotters and people, including 800 killed. One of the most famous of theirs, and was very successful, was Abu Jihad. Now, Abu Jihad was the leader of Fatah. He was the second in command to Yasser Arafat. And he'd been successful from his point of view of getting many suicide bombers actually into Israel, blowing up people on buses and markets and places like that. And he'd also been responsible for the uprising on the border with Palestine and the border between Palestine and Israel in Fatah, the first one. And for 23 years, Mossad had been tracking him and following him. And they decided in 1998 to actually kill him. But this required a military operation. It required very fast planes that could actually get to Tunisia, because he lived in Tunisia, 1,200 miles away, under the radar, in order for certain people to parachute out. It also required a landing of helicopters near the house in order to take them away, the assassins, and it also required a hospital ship. It was an operation which only a state could possibly command. And his assassin is the next slide, Mr. Nahum Lev. And he was parachuted in and disguised as a honeymooner with a girl with flowers and a box of chocolates, disguising their weapons. And they walked quite some way to his house. And then they checked that he was in the house by tapping his telephone. And he went up to his bedroom and found Jihad and his wife there. And in his own words, Nahum Lev said, "I shot him with a long burst of fire. He was a dead man walking. I shot him without hesitation." And the leader of Fatah was taken out. The next one is now much more recent. This only happened last year. And this was a Malaysian professor of engineering living in Kuala Lumpur. But he was also an advisor to the Iran government. And he was preparing and helping them to prepare a much more powerful range of bombs and rockets. And Israel and the Mossad had tracked this down, and so they assassinated this man, actually in Kuala Lumpur. And Hamas sent him a guard of honor for his funeral. The next one, the person that was considered for assassination several times, was Yasser Arafat. And certain proposals have been made to various prime ministers, because the prime minister, the form in Israel, is the prime minister has to sign off each particular named person who was assassinated. And proposals were to Golda Meir, and she said, no, we must not assassinate him. He's a very popular figure, and what's more, if we assassinate him, they'll start assassinating our chief ministers. Other prime ministers considered it and turned it down. But earlier this century, the Prime Minister Sharon, who was very much a very proactive right-winger, wanted to, in fact, assassinate Yasser Arafat. But George Bush, the second George Bush, ordered him not to do it. On no account, you must murder Arafat. It'd be quite unacceptable to me and to the world. And Sharon showed him this photograph, and he said this photograph had been taken by an Israeli sniper, so we could have shot him then. And that was very rare because Arafat virtually slept in a different bed every night. He moved around so much, it was very, very difficult to track him down. And so Sharon said, we have an opportunity. And Bush said, no, you must not do it. The other country that has used assassination is Russia. And several Tsars in Russia were assassinated. And this one, Alexander II, was assassinated on the 31st of March, 1881, in a period of what was known as the Golden Age of assassination, up to 1914. He happened to be the most liberal Tsar that had ever reigned in Russia. He ended serfdom. He made changes in the court procedures to make it much easier for actions to be quicker and to help poorer people. And he was, at the time of his assassination, preparing a proposal for a form of local government for local authorities. But a revolutionary group called the People's Will, actually led by a woman, Sofia Perevalskaya, decided that they wanted to kill him. And 3 attempts were made, and he escaped narrowly each one. On this occasion, he didn't escape. He was returning from church on a Sunday morning in his carriage. And this is the little carte de visite, a local contemporary one that was made describing what happened. The bomb was thrown under his carriage. He was thrown out, bleeding on the floor, and his legs were virtually off him. And he died before he got to hospital. It was, in fact, not very satisfactory from the point of view of the People's Will, because Alexander's successor reversed virtually all the relaxations that he brought in and restored a Tsarist police state rule. And it's possible that if those changes had been made, the Bolsheviks may not have actually had a revolution. It's a vague possibility, as it were. So I think this might have had a glancing blow on history. The second Tsar, his grandson to be assassinated, was Nicholas II. And he'd resigned as Tsar, and Lenin and Trotsky didn't know what to do with him. They didn't want to keep him in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, because he would become the agent for plotters and the White Army and all the rest of it. And so they sent him to Ekaterinburg, another city in central Russia in the Urals, on the main railway line from east to west. And again, they were not. One of them wanted to be tried, the other one did not want him to be tried. They had not decided. But what the pressure was building up, because there was a civil war, and the White Army of the royalist supporters, supported by Czech troops, were advancing on Ekaterinburg and would soon take it. And so the local Bolsheviks had to make their own decision. And Lenin and Trotsky really rather pushed it upon them, as it were. And they had a very elaborate records of who attended all the meetings, and they're all the local people. Whether it's unlikely that Lenin and Trotsky ever said do it, but they created the circumstances when willing supporters would do it automatically. I'm sure they did. And the next slide shows the room in which they were shot, the Apativ cellar, and the actual executioner. It's all absolutely known. The names of all the people who were in the firing squad are known as well. But the capacity of Russia to kill its leaders, or its leaders to kill other people, continued. And Stalin, in fact, assassinated a large number of people. These were 2 close friends who were the great leaders of the revolution, Kirov and Stalin. And at a conference in 1934, the candidate at the conference expressed, after the conference, they were asked to sort of mark the leaders, as it were, which was a great mistake, because Kirov easily won. And Stalin then decided to shoot him, have him shot. Where there is no person, there is no problem. And he went on to do that with all his other old friends, Zinoviev and Bukharin and Zvenev, and they were all not shot. they were tried by another form of assassination, crooked courts. And Stalin, in fact, through crooked courts, killed hundreds, if not thousands of people, including those 3 former friends. They were all promised that if they confessed, they'd be released. They all confessed and were executed the following day. This habit of Russian rulers does, however, continue under Putin. And the next slide is Putin. This is 2004 with Putin as president, and this is Putin interfering in the Ukrainian election when Viktor Yushchenko was standing for re-election. And he was poisoned with a poison called dioxin, which made his face grow very aged and put him like that. He has recovered from that, and it did not prevent him from being re-elected. This is a very clear proof that he's not going to let Belarus become taken over by NATO and the West and the liberal democracy. He will certainly intervene to ensure that Belarus is remained firmly within his grip. The next one that he did was Litvinenko, who was a Russian journalist who defected to Britain and spilt lots of beans about how the security services operated and how Putin fixed things. And it was decided that he should be poisoned. And 2 men were sent over and put plutonium in his cup of tea at a hotel in London. I think it was the Waldorf Hotel. Litvinenko survived, was able to identify the 2 very clearly. And our security forces then produced a whole series of pictures of them arriving at the airport, staying at a hotel in London, photographing the prostitutes they ordered for the night, and also their departure. And they also found plutonium in the lavatory bowls and traces of plutonium in the basin and all the rest of it. Absolutely proof positive. And this guy, who is one of the assassins, Andrea Lagozzi, denies it totally, of course, and not guilty. He's now been made a member of the Duma, which means that he can't be touched by the law under any circumstances. That was in 2014 and 2006, rather. This is Putin meeting Nemetsov. Now, Nemetsov had been a deputy prime minister under Yeltsin and was being groomed, as it were, to be president. But Putin sidled his way in and got early control and became president. And I don't think he became leader of the opposition. I can't help feeling that Putin didn't like the leader of the opposition was taller than him, but he arranged for him to be assassinated, walking over the bridge with his fiancée near the Kremlin, shot as the leader of the opposition. And one which we're all familiar with is the next one, when he attempted to poison Skripal. Skripal had been served a prison sentence of 15 years in Russia for selling secrets. And Putin made clear that when he was released, that we never forget our traitors. And on this particular occasion, his death was organized by the secret services of the military, the GRU. And they are a law to themselves, this particular group. And these are the 2 who came. And Putin said they were tourists. Do you remember? He said they were going to look at Salisbury Cathedral. And then our security services, or rather, there's an independent body in Russia which helps also to reveal information of this sort, and risking death by doing it, found out their exact passports, their exact names, and it was so naive and so amateurish that they put down not their date of birth, but their address was the address of the main headquarters of the GRU, and they'd been known and identified. And one of the television services actually tracked down one of their mothers in Siberia before she was stopped talking. And she said, "Oh yes, that's my son. Yes, I recognize the voice very clearly." And this has all been pictured, absolutely pictured and known. And they threw away the poison bottle. The poison bottle, they used Novichok. Incidentally, it's been announced only today that Novolany in a German hospital has also been poisoned by Novichok. So it's quite clearly that Putin is still at it, or his supporters are at it. And he creates the conditions when his supporters actually do it without actually being physically instructed by him. It's rather like Henry II, who will rid me of this turbulent priest, and they feel they're doing a good thing. That was a complete revelation. And I suspect also they will track down exactly how the poison was administered to Navalny. And this is a good cartoon by Peter Brooks that appeared in the Times. And there's a picture of Litvinenko. Here is Markov, who was actually stabbed on Waterloo Bridge with a poisoned umbrella by Bulgarians. It was all organized by the KGB. Poisoned, spy lad guilty, Kremlin connection. What a nerve. What a nerve indeed. Now let me turn on to where Britain has used targeted killing. Because in the ISIS war from 2014 to 18, we used drones, in fact, to kill certain people. And this man, Raed Khan, had left Britain and become an important leader in ISIS, in recruiting more people from Britain and also planning events in Britain. And Philip Hammond, the Defence Secretary, approved that he should be killed by a drone. And that approval was actually supported by David Cameron in a speech. And he said, this is an act of self-defence. We're in a state of war, in effect, and it is quite legitimate to use drones. So drones have now become a method of assassination. And of course, earlier, you may remember, earlier this year, how Trump used a drone to take out Qasem Soleimani, who was the leading figure of the Iranians in opposing Trump and attacking Israel. And so drones have now become a way of very precision assassination. And there were two others that we did. And the next one, this is Jihadi Johnny, who executed 7 people, beheading them. And he was taken out by a drone on the 12th of November 2015. It was an American drone, but it was done with British intelligence and British support. And the next one is Sally Jones. The United Nations branded her as one of the most wanted terrorists in the world. She had actually been a member of a punk band, but she became a fanatical Muslim terrorist. Again, recruiting a lot of people, organizing events, and she was taken out again by an American drone with British support in July 2017, with she and her child. Now, one group of people who have been targeted by the state are investigative journalists, and I have a whole chapter on them. And this is the first one I want to deal with. This is Maria Colvin, probably the greatest war correspondent of our generation, or the past generation. And this is when she wanted to go into Syria when Homs was about to be destroyed. Homs was subjected to a range of heavy bombing, and it was only got a few days to survive. And she wanted to be there right at the end. And she managed to get in secretly into Homs, although the Assad security forces had identified that she was in Syria. And she got right in, as it were, to the front line. And she filed a report to the CNN on her mobile phone. And that was really her undoing. She wanted it to go directly and personally. And the Assad security forces identified where exactly she was as a result of that. And they then did some range bombing. They dropped a bomb short and they dropped a bomb too far. And they eventually got a bomb actually on the place when she was just leaving. And the state, many states, in fact, take action against investigative journalists. Another example is Malta. This is Daphne Galizia, an investigative journalist who was beginning to investigate the Prime Minister of Malta, Muscat, and his wife for corrupting European money and directing it into their own accounts, with the full support of his chief of staff and ministers in the government, the Minister of Tourism. And she was blown up in a car. It was absolutely outrageous, and it caused a great deal of attention. The United Nations has demanded an independent United Nations examination of this assassination. One person has been arrested, the richest man in Malta, as he was just about to sail away in his yacht, a billionaire, and he's awaiting trial. And the trouble really is that Malta has become the soft underbelly of the mafia in Europe. And she was a very fearless woman, and her son and her family are fighting very hard for the real truth to come out. Now, one with which you will remember is state killing by Saudi Arabia of Khashoggi. Here he is going in to the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul just a few minutes before his death. And a group of 12 people had come in. Somebody also went out, and it was apparently disguised as him leaving it so that later in the day they could say, look, he left it walking out. But he hadn't bothered to change his shoes. He didn't have to change shoes and all that. A very amateurish bunch, this lot, but quite determined. And within a few minutes he was dead, because the Turkish security services had actually maintained listening devices in it. And I have spoken to somebody who's read the actual record, and it's very harrowing and very unpleasant and quite definite. He was killed, murdered, and he was cut up into pieces. And for some time, when put in suitcase, we didn't know what happened to it. But eventually, it was discovered that it was likely to be burnt in the tandoori oven of the consulate's private house, which had been specially expanded. And this is the cartoon by Peter Brooks, which says it absolutely brilliantly and pinpoints it. And now for my next trick, I will make it all disappear. And Mohammed bin Salman was definitely involved in this, knew about it, and approved it. Now, I want to now deal with the assassination which did change the world. The assassination of Franz Joseph. This is a wonderfully recent photograph coloured by this brilliant Brazilian artist. That makes it much more vivid. And he's wearing the pale blue uniform of the main regiment in Austro-Hungary. In 1908, Austro-Hungary had taken over Bosnia as a colony. But many Bosnians, the majority of the population was Serbs, wanted to join to Serbia. And so a movement did start of Bosnian nationalists wanting to join to Serbia, which Serbia rather encouraged. And one of the young Bosnian nationalists, is the next slide, is Gavril Princip. And he got a little group of 6 other Bosnian nationalists. 3 of them went over to Serbia and were given revolvers and given bombs. And in one afternoon were shown how to fire revolvers. That's all the training they had, and how to alert a bomb. And they went back and they decided to try and kill Franz Joseph on his rather unusual visit to Sarajevo. He wanted to go to Sarajevo with his wife because he could take his wife on an official visit. He couldn't take his wife on an official visit in Austria because it was a morganatic marriage. And so he was rather looking forward to going to Sarajevo. And he arrived in the train in the morning and got into a little motorcade of 5 cars. That's all it was. And the car he was in had been lent by one of his rich friends. They set off on a long straight road to go to the town hall alongside the canal. And along that long straight road, about 7 kilometers, the 6 assassins were all placed. And the first one lost his nerve and did nothing. The second one did throw a bomb. It landed under the second car and injured an officer. But after a short stop, the other cars all moved on and got to the town hall, where Franz Joseph was very angry indeed. He said, here you are, I come to Sarajevo and people are throwing bombs. It really is outrageous. And the governor of Bosnia said, don't worry, I can assure you of the great security. We're all right going back. We'll devise another route and we will, and you'll be quite safe. Somebody, a major, did actually recommend they should wait 3 hours until the Austrian army arrived, due to arrive in Sarajevo, and they could have cleared the streets. If they had taken his advice, the Second World War would not have occurred. But such is the bad luck of history. And the next slide shows Franz Joseph leaving the town hall with his wife. And it is extraordinary. There's not a policeman in sight. There's no soldiers in sight. There's no security at all for him on this visit. And this is his car as he's going along. As you can see, a few residents are cheering him. You can't even see the next car, that's so far behind. And just after this picture was taken, the driver, by mistake, turned right because he hadn't been told about the new route. And the governor who was in the car said, stop, and the car stopped. And it so happened it stopped just beside Gavril Princip. It was pure luck. He got the revolver out of his pocket. He didn't even aim it. He just fired it straight at the car. And the first bullet went through the side door straight into the abdomen of the Archduchess, who died almost immediately. The revolver recoiled. He didn't aim it. He just fired again as it recoiled. And the bullet happened to go through the neck. of the Archduke. It was an incredibly lucky set of events from the point of view of Pinker, but disastrous for the world. And 35 days later, what had been a Bosnian dispute between Austro-Hungary and Serbia over Bosnia became a world war. And this was how the Daily Mirror saw it on the day of the war. They just couldn't understand why the conflict between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who was a very elderly old man, and King Peter of Serbia, was going to lead to this death. Now, I remember once with Helen Macmillan, in a reflective mood, to dinner in the Carlton Club on one summer evening, standing in the drawing room looking down on St James's Street. Said, he always liked to reminisce like this. I said, I remember standing in this room one evening in July when I saw a newspaper boy, because they carried big ones, messages hung on boards beneath their trousers, hanging from their trousers, saying Archduke assassinated. Little did I think that this news would lead within little more than a month to a war that would change the history of the world and would also lead to the death of so many of my friends. It was an absolutely extraordinary event and a world-shattering one. Now, I want to end on two lucky escapes, which are very interesting. And this is Hitler. He was lucky twice. He was lucky first on November the 8th in 1939, because on that day, he always went down to the beer cellar in Munich, where in 1923 the Nazi movement started. And it was a rapturous evening. He gave a rabble-rousing speech. They loved him. And he always arrived at 8:30 and left at 10 o'clock, absolutely to the minute. And there was a strange single figure, unknown to the security forces. He was a joiner called George Elsa, who decided that if there was a war, he was very worried about the conditions of German workers, and they would get much worse if there was a war. So he decided quite by himself to kill the Führer. He visited the beer cellar several times by himself, very patiently, and hollowed out a wooden pillar, just at the back of the stage, to make a little hole, make a little cavern, as it were. And then he practiced with bombs in his parents' garden. And he took a bomb along on the day before, on the 7th of November, and placed it in the little hollow he made out. And then he made off to get to Switzerland. And he timed it to go off at 9:20, as it were, little more than halfway through when Hitler was going to be there. But on this night, Hitler ended his speech at 9:07, and he decided to leave immediately because it was the second day of the war, and the French had invaded the Saarland, and he wanted to get back to Berlin. And the bomb went off 13 minutes later. If he had stayed on, even to 9:30, he'd have been killed. And that would have changed the history of the world. Because who would have taken over? Goering, Himmler, or the generals? No one, you could just speculate. But it wouldn't have been that demonic, manic figure. And he was lucky again in 1944 when Stauffenberg tried to leave a bomb under his table, and it didn't hit him. And here he is showing it off to Mussolini, who visited him that afternoon. In this particular case, it wouldn't have been quite so devastating as the first one, because it would have probably brought the war to an end more quickly, and that might have had an effect of preventing Russia sweeping right through into Berlin with its forces and its dominance in Eastern Europe. But this can only be speculative. But if either event had taken place, the history of the world would have been changed. My final example was the Brighton bombing of Margaret Thatcher when there was an attempt to kill her and members of her cabinet. If Margaret had been assassinated that night, the next leader of the Conservative Party would have been either Michael Heseltine or Geoffrey Howe. All the other candidates were ruled out. Cecil Parkinson, because of his affair with his secretary, Norman Tebbit, because he was very severely wounded in the event, and Nigel Lawson had only been Chancellor for quite a short time. His greatness lay ahead of him. And that meant the Tory party would have been led by a passionately pro-European Prime Minister all through the 1980s. And they would have certainly tried to exclude and to limit the Eurosceptics. And if that had worked, who knows, there might never have been a referendum and we might still be in Europe. So that is really the end of my talk. I still take the view that I started at the beginning, that assassinations are on the whole poison chalices and they don't change the history of the world. But I hope you enjoyed it. some of you may not agree with me.
Thank you very much indeed, Kenneth. That was a wonderful talk. Looking at my image there, I'm looking rather like a dark assassin myself. Apologies for that. Please put questions forward. You're very welcome. We try and take as many as possible. Because of the technical difficulty tonight making the start, I'm going to break a rule for the first time in 40 talks, which is to go beyond 7, but I'll finish at 7:05 precisely. That will give us 12 minutes for questions. And the first, Kenneth, is the ability, the technical ability of the assassin, e.g. with drones, advancing more quickly than the power of the state to resist that assassination? And how real is the threat on Trump, given that 4 American presidents have been assassinated out of 45, but only 1 out of 55 British prime ministers?
Well, if you're going to take on a leader, you first have to have very good security services to determine where he is at a particular time, because it's got to be very precise. It's got to hit them, like he did with Qasem Soleimani earlier this year. It was known exactly he was leaving the airport in a particular car at a particular time. That requires huge security, and so only the state can really do that sort of assassination. But as drones are now being more and more developed, it'll be possible, actually, I'm quite sure, for certain other people to have an attempt. That is the inevitable development of this particular technology. And it'll be very difficult to control, And of course, one doesn't quite know the process of decision that Trump took to do it. Did he do it just on his own initiative? Did the military, because proposals to assassinate Qasem Soleimani had been made to 2 previous presidents who turned it down. I don't know whether the security forces had made their own proposal to go again, or whether it was Trump who did it. But there has to be, as it were, a legal process to do this, because you're taking out someone's life.
So a question from Diana on the psychology of the assassin. Are they in some ways very brave? Lee Harvey Oswald, who you said was a sole assassin, Kenneth, not everyone would obviously agree with that, and Gavrilo Princip, what drives these people to take a course of action that's almost certainly going to result in their own death?
Well, first, assassins are not cowards. They're quite brave people, because they know they're likely to be arrested. They might actually be savaged on the day themselves, if caught, and killed on sight. And so they become very committed. The individual assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald, was very committed for some reason. We don't know why, that he wanted to kill Kennedy. It's more evident in many other cases, like the one who killed Alexander II. The woman was a passionate revolutionary, and she knew it, and she had a group to support her. And there's usually commitment. And in the period which is known as the Golden Era assassinations from 1880 to 1914, a lot of leading figures like King Umberto of Italy and King George of Greece were killed by anarchists. Anarchism became a very fashionable, extreme form of revolutionary behavior in the late 19th century. And anarchists believed, and one American president, McKinley, was shot by an anarchist when he was attending a trade fair. And so it's very often the passion, the determination of an assassin like Charlotte Corday, because they're usually very passionate people.
A question from Lisa there about on the Kennedy. Will we ever get to the truth of the John F. Kennedy assassination? And why is this so difficult to get to when so many other assassinations, it's clear who did it?
Well, he didn't leave any evidence. He didn't leave a note or anything sort. He wasn't able to say anything himself. He was shot. And what they have tracked down subsequently is that he did visit a KGB officer in Turkey a few weeks before the actual assassination. And some people say that he was therefore put up to by the KGB. I think that's, but other people dismiss that as a possibility. And I think that this is one of those things that will never be resolved. There have been endless reports, the Warren Commission and others, on this assassination, and bits were found out. There was a time when it was thought there was another bullet and another assassin. But I think it's probably written out. I don't think there's much more than new can be discovered actually on this. At least I'd be surprised if there was.
Question from Adam about what are the techniques that are being used to keep the Prime Minister and the American President and the French President and Angela Merkel in Germany safe? What are the skills, given that in the films that the assassinations are often successful?
Well, first thing, just on MPs, it's almost impossible to save MPs if someone is determined to kill them. Joe Cox, for example, was murdered by a deranged racist, because MPs have to meet their ordinary constituents and all the rest of it. MPs now, PMs, and I saw this my Home Secretary, get considerable protection indeed. And for example, there are no open motorcades now in American politics, because anybody in a motorcade can be shot by anybody who happens to be in a skyscraper with a rifle. And there are things like that. And there's a huge wave of security around the British Prime Minister and certain other ministers. Usually the Secretary for Northern Ireland and the Home Secretary also get security protection while they hold those positions and have it for a few years after they leave. But someone like Tony Blair, for example, will have it right until probably he dies, because he was involved so heavily in Ireland at the time. And there are people who believe that, as he was one of the proponents of the Good Friday Agreement, that was the great betrayal of Ireland. And so he'll probably get it. Margaret would have got it if they got it right really until the end.
And you yourself, Mark is asking about your own security. You were Home Secretary. Were you yourself worried about being assassinated?
Yes, when you're Home Secretary, you virtually have policemen living in your house or very close to your house. And they certainly set up a hut in our country house in the garden, because the Home Secretary, by his very nature, has to make decisions on things like the freeing of prisoners or sometimes the length of sentences of long-term serving prisoners. And therefore, there are people who are interested in the actual decisions he makes. And therefore, he receives protection while he's Home Secretary and for some years afterwards. And it's the same also with the Northern Ireland Secretary. Northern Ireland secretaries were protected for some considerable years. And there was one, Roy Mason was the secretary during a particularly difficult time, the Dirty protest. And he received protection. And when long after the event, when he resigned and was no longer even a minister, long after he was no longer in the House of Commons, he always resisted the security being moved from him. And he would always make a violently strong speech in the Irish newspapers, say how very important it was to actually control them even firmer. And then he proved this, and it was reported in the newspapers. He said, look, I can still be attacked. So people like security. I didn't like security. I was very glad that when it all ended, quite frankly.
Did you see Bodyguard, the celebrated BBC series about the Home Secretary being assassinated?
Yes, I did, yes.
It didn't worry you. And by the way, two figures you mentioned there, we've had earlier talks from Joe Cox's very moving sister. Do all of listeners listen to Kim talking about her sister Jo and the impact of that assassination on all their lives, but also the good work she's done. And you mentioned Marie Colvin, and we had Christina Lamb, the very brave, famous Sunday Times war correspondent, talking earlier in the series too. Jenny is worried, Lord Baker, about Russia killing people at an alarming rate. What can be done to stop them?
Well, there have been sanctions used against Russia. If anything is improved on Navalny, I would certainly support more sanctions on Russia. This is really a pariah state at the moment. It is run entirely by Putin for himself and for the gang around him. And it's no longer really a functioning democracy. There are investigative journalists. In my book, there's another one, Maxim Borodin, was a young journalist who was beginning to write stories about the number of Russians who were killed in Ukraine. And he was found of having fallen from a balcony, a 5-story balcony of his flat. And he told one of his friends the day before, I've seen people in camouflage on the staircase. I don't know why they're here. And so that's another method of doing it, throwing people out of a balcony. And then in order to threaten them, they'll often find a journalist an open window in their flat as an indication, watch it, we're watching you.
Right. I hope people are going to sleep well tonight. Ruth's wondering if state-sponsored killings are on the rise. And David says, do you think it's easier to assassinate people now than in the past?
I think there are more weapons. The suicide bomber is a very effective way of assassinating someone who is completely, they believe, is a heathen or a sinner or an evil person. That is still continues, I'm afraid. Drones, I think, are a very serious danger, because I think they possibly could be eventually loaded with small loadings of gunpowder or bombs or things of that sort. And that is a very worrying development, quite frankly.
Or a virus.
Or a virus. Well, yes, I know. You know, this is the worst thing ever. I remember when I was Home Secretary in the first Gulf War, we were very concerned about the possibility of Saddam Hussein using chemical or biological weapons. And I had lots of briefings on it as to what could happen. And it's very devastating what can happen with a chemical or a biological weapon. Very devastating. It's Coriolanus 100 times worse.
Two quick final questions. Jack says, slightly controversially, should we be taking out Putin, Lord Baker?
No, because we are a democracy and we believe in freedom and we believe in law and we're decent, honourable people. No, we shouldn't. But we should be quite sure that the world knows that he is a murderous villain, absolutely involved in all of the. Is he
more murderous than those who were killed by drones on the instigation of the Prime Minister?
Well, they were in a war.
Okay, all right.
America and Britain and America decided to destroy ISIS. It was a war condition. Putin is not fighting a war. Well, he's fighting a war in the Ukraine, quite frankly. But he's not fighting a war. He's taking out people who threaten his own position.
And maybe in Belarus coming up. And I've saved Isaac's question to last. I hope, Isaac, you're still here, who's come back to Octavian. Is it true that Octavian took greater power? But could one not make the argument that without the assassination, so it's really asking you to speculate about the impact of that.
Well, Octavian's powers were very, very wide indeed for the emperor. They could do virtually anything, and it varied. And the empire eventually, as it now declined and fell through the incompetence of the Roman emperors. And I decided not to examine any of the Roman emperors, because half the Roman emperors were assassinated mainly by the Praetorian Guard, because they were not given enough money and their time had run out. And so I do feel that, in fact, the first assassination paved the way to, in fact, the dictatorship that the empire became.
So we're going to finish there. Our time has run out. I'm going to mention again the book by Lord Baker, which is a hugely original, wide-ranging, wide-thinking talk. We have had several thousands. At the very beginning, we had 1945 that was listening in. It was a pretty historically significant date. That was at the beginning. Apologies again to everybody for the technology, meaning it was a slightly late start and therefore a slightly late ending. Tomorrow night, Andrew Roberts talking about Churchill and other matters, and then we have the book has just come up there, Hugo Vickers talking about the truth about the series on The Crown. We were talking about The Bodyguard a moment ago, The Crown, and what the royal family really is like, and all the questions you want to ask that you never dared ask before. And then we've got Marie Elsa Bragg from the famous Bragg family, talking about spirituality and wholeness. So those are the next 3 talks coming up. Please circulate the series to friends, but above all, Lord Baker, wow, I mean, what an extraordinary talk, so energetic, so wide-ranging, and thank you very, very much indeed from all of us at the University of Buckingham and way beyond, to you down in Sussex, and our very best wishes to you and for the book, and we're deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Hope the others did as well.